What a big crowd. I don't know why it seems a lot bigger to me than usual, and it's probably about the same number. Maybe I just don't look up that far away from where I'm standing. Today's program, which you can see titled up there, Pulp, Peavy, and Pike, Historic Log Drives of the Connecticut, is being presented by Helen Pike, whose father collected the stories of men, and at least one woman, who managed to get timber out of the backwoods to mills along the Connecticut River every spring until 1915. Doing so required impressive strength, balance, courage, and determination to fight multiple challenges. Helen's father, logging historian Robert E. Pike, wrote the book Tall Trees, Tough Men, which remains a landmark book since it was first published in 1967. Helen wrote the foreword to the fourth edition of its precursor, Spiked Boots, Sketches of the North Country. Helen was born into a family of writers and has herself written 14 illustrated history books, several of which center around Asbury Park on the North Jersey shore. She has also been included in several anthologies and one Italian translation. Very impressive. Moving to the Upper Connecticut River Valley in 2012, Helen blogs about numismatics for the Littleton Coin Company, while at the same time working on a family memoir. Please give a hearty welcome to Helen Pike.
All right, I'm not scared of you. I don't have to imagine you without your clothes on, okay? I lectured at Rutgers University, and I had a lot of drunken football players in my lecture series, so after that, this is a cakewalk. I'm thrilled to be here as a repeat lecturer to this OSHA program that you have here in Springfield. And I promised Marita, after she warned me, to not duplicate what I did in 2017. So I think I only have 2 images, and if you were here in 2017, it's up to you to figure out which 2 are repeats. So this is also the first time I've been completely wired up like this, and I've never had a laptop before, so please bear with me. I don't think I'm going to turn this off, but I do hope I'm going to be able to do this going forward. So this is essentially, if you're not familiar with the Connecticut River Valley, I'm going to take you down from the headwaters really to about mid-Massachusetts, but Connecticut actually empties out at Old Saybrook, Connecticut, into the Long Island Sound. And there was a breakaway log drive one year that went all the way out into the Long Island Sound. Okay, so, okay, I see how this goes. So these are the 2 titles of the covers. This is what they look like currently. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these as we go along. These are the precursors. Okay, so Spiked Boots was the first book that came out. Long story about that. The publisher who was going to publish this in Maine went bankrupt. And so my father had to dig around and teach night school to find extra money to make good on the money that people lost giving this publisher in Maine the money to publish the book. This is, if you're familiar, if you have children or grandchildren who do CDs and they go around, they ask everybody to buy the CD ahead of time. That purchase price allows them to go into a studio. It's called a subscription model, and this is similar to what Dad was doing with Leon Tebbets in Bangor, Maine. So there'll be more about Spiked Boots, and eventually the first edition of Tall Trees, Tough Men had this jacket on it, and this is what the 2 books looked like for a long period of time. So this is the iron bridge that connected Upper Waterford, the village where my father was raised, with Pattonville, New Hampshire. neither of which exist anymore once the construction of Moore Dam was completed in 1954, and they flooded the whole river valley as a reservoir for hydroelectric power. But if you were a child growing up in either one of these two communities, you would, in fact, when the logs came down in April, usually, and sometimes you'd be let out of school to do this. If there was a sighting of them, you would stand on the iron bridge and you would watch the logs come down. And this is where my father had, a front row seat to these log drives, including the last long log drive, in which the logs were 20 feet long, that came down the Connecticut River. And this photograph I found in the town vault of Waterford, where I've been living for 14 years, and identified, you can sort of tell by the gentleman down here at the bottom, in particular, that trio over there in the middle, they're looking up at the photographer who is on the bridge trying to photograph this scene going downriver. So this side here, let's see, how's this going to be? Your left? Yes, this is New Hampshire, and that's Vermont on that side. And you will see that there are some logs that are hung up on or boomed on the riverbank over here, and you'll see a bateau. We'll have a couple more pictures of that. So if you imagine a 10-year-old who was being raised on the family farm in Upper Waterford, the two men who were central to his life were Vern Davison and Harley Pike, his uncle. And this is the back side of the village of Upper Waterford, the church. And the family house is the one that's white up there on the side. I have no pointer, sorry about that. And because both of these men had worked for George Van Dyke, Harley, my great uncle, would let them put their tents up on his meadows, which were what you see up there, as they're coming down, because they're waiting for more logs to come through. They're taking a break. And the stories my father first started to collect when he was a youngster came from these two men. So much so that in 1952, this was he published the story and he used Vern's name. It's one of the several pseudonyms I discovered my father had. And I figured out enough by this point to recognize who these people were. And in an album that I am slowly deconstructing, but I kept this intact, is a picture of that he took of Vern in Upper Waterford when Vern was kind of dressed up for some reason. And it was rather sweet. He said, "My friend Vern Davison." And the stories that Vern had told him became part of this 4-page piece in Argosy magazine. There we go. And at the time, they weren't called rivermen; they were called bearcats. You almost never hear that, but you do hear the Bangor tigers in Maine. So there's an association with wildlife that were pretty ruthless and fearless in telling the stories. My father wrote this in his study in Eatontown, New Jersey. And on the other side of that bookcase was my bedroom. And so as a child, as an infant, in fact, growing up, the sound I would hear was every night when he'd come back from teaching would be the sound of the typewriter. Some of you maybe fall asleep to the sound of a washing machine. I can fall asleep to the sound of a manual typewriter. So what is he telling the story? He's telling the story of pine trees, fir trees, hemlock, and it goes all the way back to our founding era as colonies for the British Empire, and that they needed masts for their ships. And so in 1966, there was a diary kept by the Undersecretary of the British Admiralty, and he wrote, "The very good news comes from the 4 New England ships came home safe to Falmouth with masts for the king." And in fact, the royal governor of Massachusetts made an edict that said any tree that was more than 24 inches in circumference could not be cut down unless it was on private land. So keeping the British Empire literally afloat was central to their success. And this gives you an idea of what the masts masts looked like. And this is what looked like. This is a painting of Connecticut. It's one example. It's one of the better examples that I could find when Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts were practically deforested. And you might hear that term a lot. You're going to hear it a few more times from me coming up, because the need for logs, for wood, for lumber was just unending in those early years before the Civil War. In my real photo collection, this is Concord Corner up in Essex County near where I live, and this was a view up from Dalton, New Hampshire into Concord Corner, and it shows you the same deforestation was taking place. Yes, you had a few trees to maybe mark a property line along with a stone fence, but for the most part, it was all cut down for farming, sheep farming, eventually dairy farming, some produce farming, of course, for sustenance. And so in 1879, investors in Hartford, Connecticut put together a company called the Connecticut River Lumber Company, and they sent scouts north of Hartford, Connecticut, all the way as far north as they could find the headwaters of the Connecticut River, to look for timberland and anybody that could be hired or have a business deal made with to cut lumber to bring it back to Massachusetts and Connecticut. And so, how many of you have been this far north in? Oh, good. Yay! All right. So I highly urge you to. It's an area that has been it's been developing. New groups of people are finding it. It's a huge place for outdoor enthusiasts, and I can't recommend it enough. I have a lot of pictures with rivermen with their backs to the camera from Indian Stream and Perry Stream, and it doesn't tell a whole lot, and I decided not to include those here because I think you might be bored by them. However, this is the photograph that I did find, also in my father's album, the French-Canadian woodsman at Depot Camp on Indian Stream. So Jeffrey, this is where you take the picture with your cell phone. So Jeffrey, sorry, I'm outing you in front of 163 people. Jeffrey wrote me about his grandfather, Mr. Boucher, and you might pronounce it differently, who had worked for George Van Dyke, who had done lumbering up in the woods, and he wanted to know if my father had ever interviewed him. And for the most part, it wasn't until much later that there was any written letters that my father kept, because all of this marked his childhood, then his high school years, then his college years at Dartmouth College, where in the summer he surveyed the Dartmouth land grant up in the Pittsburgh, New Hampshire area, going west towards Maine and then further up into Canada. And so it was clear that he was collecting these stories from a variety of men that he encountered. And thank God that he did, because we wouldn't know about any of this if it weren't for him doing this. So this is the Fourth Connecticut Lake. I just found this aerial. It's from a drone. It's drone photography. But outdoor sports writer by the name of Gary Marshall, who's syndicated in various local newspapers, physically had to haul me all the way up. There's a hiking trail now, though, so if you don't have mobility issues, you might be, you should be able to make it a lot easier than I did. But of course, the requisite picture is you get a picture of you standing over where the Connecticut River comes out of, and it's a kind of a boggy area. And then it sort of keeps spilling down to Third Lake, Second Lake, First Lake, Lake Francis, and eventually it defines itself as a river. But you're pretty far up there. And they do ask you at the border crossing if you're going into Canada, if you're going hiking. And these are a few pictures of what rugged life looked like with the loggers. The one on the lower left here is from Tall Trees and Tough Men, and I'm pretty sure my father took this one. The other two came from a magazine called Granite Monthly, and this was a publication that was pretty much devoted towards everything progressive about New Hampshire. You want to buy real estate, you want to move here, you want to read about the folklore, you want to, it was very much a promotional magazine with first-person accounts of people encountering the native folks. So clearly they're all, from They're all Flatlanders who are reading this. Um, But on the opposite end of the spectrum, up on Second Connecticut Lake, is where all the city swells stayed. And George Van Dyke built this very nice accommodation called Idlewild. And any of his investor friends who sat on his board for the Connecticut Valley Lumber Company, or anybody else who was coming up to spend the summer, could stay in these accommodations that you, of course, would have to pay for. And it turns out that there was a family cousin who was a guide, and through one of these cousin things that happens, she's like 14 cousins removed from who I am, but she knew a little bit about George. And so I've been trying to piece together George and Pike's life as a summer guide, as well as an owner of a hotel. But I think that from him also came further stories. So this is Uncle Harl, my dad, and his father, William. My grandfather was the black sheep of the family. He was the baby. And he had a rather colorful and hard life. And wasn't around much, which is primarily why my father sought the company of men who had this adventuresome spirit and who were making their way in the wilds of Vermont and New Hampshire. So in Pittsburgh, I was telling this lovely group of people here in the front that there's a lovely historical society museum in a one-room schoolhouse, and they have fabulous stuff about that whole area up in Pittsburgh and the Connecticut Lakes. And they keep finding stuff, which is even more remarkable. So you can tell that these men in their suits are probably the accountants. No slight to any accountants out there. I have one. But, they're not quite made, dressed for the outdoors. And George Van Dyke is... Bangor Bank bought the local bank in Coldbrook, and they're like, well, we don't know who this fellow is. We don't want him. Who can we give this to? And somebody said, the Pittsburgh Historical Society. So they got this portrait of George Van Dyke. And George was born into poverty in either East Hereford or Stanbridge, Quebec. Legend differs exactly where, but if you go to East Hereford in Quebec province, there is a whole sort of lumber drive that you can take that has signage there to the Van Dyke family. And he basically included in his business his brother Thomas, who took care of a lot of the operations in Pittsburgh, and another brother, Philo, whom you'll meet shortly. He didn't have shoes when he was a child. The family was extremely poor, and he went to work in the woods. And eventually, he had the business smarts to figure out how this worked. And also, he wasn't afraid to take business away from other people. And so the successor company to the Connecticut Valley Lumber Company is the St. Regis Paper Company, which is St. Regis, Paper Company. And this is an anchor they have outside their museum, which is when you would get huge iron chains, and you would use these to corral the logs in Second Lake before you started funneling them to go down the river. You need an anchor for all these iron chains. Now, it didn't wrap the logs, which is an issue I'm going to bring up a little later. So just remember that. This was sort of the way you would create the outline of, let's say, a swimming pool, okay, in this way. And this was from the Granite magazine that gives you an idea of how they created dams. So my father had the chance to meet Grinner Shoppy, and he was of German descent. He came over from Maine to go work for George Van Dyke, and he had, without any formal training, knew enough about engineering and how to build dams, and he built these crib dams. Now what you learn, and I know we have had some pretty harsh summers where the water level has been pretty low in the Connecticut River, or even your local swimming hole, your ponds, your lakes. But the amount of water in the Connecticut River has always been up and down. And there would be some seasons where there would not be enough water to float the logs down. So Van Dyke company had to create these dams to be able to float the logs. And there were times when the water could be really low. Now, the power company has created enough dams that it can also control the flow and the height or the depth of the water behind these dams. But back then, this was a this is the precursor to the very fancy dams we have today. And there's some wonderful stories in both Tall Trees, Tough Men and in Spiked Boots about Grinner. And I don't want to spoil them for you because I really think you should go to your local library and at least get Spiked Boots. But his favorite expression was gaseous, no R, not gracious. It was always gaseous. And he was known for keeping the peace. And his title on the last long log drive of 1915 is he was rear of the boss. So he made sure that the logs would be coming down the river, all of them, in that year. And the walking boss, who was at the head of the river, was a man also big and burly by the name of Alphonse Roby, or Fonce, again, with a hyphen, excuse me. Thank you, an apostrophe. And so there's I could go down a lot of rabbit holes, but I'm going to try to keep you focused. So one of the things that's interesting to me and has been is that there's visual evidence still up in that area of the CVL, the Connecticut Valley Lumber Company. When George finally took it over completely, by the year 1900, he was a millionaire. He owned 150,000 acres of timberland. He loved to gamble, and he was good to his mother. And that's all I'm going to say. And there he is in his car with his chauffeur, Shorty Hodgson. So the successor to the CVL company was the St. Regis paper. Now, this little White House was actually the Connecticut Valley Lumber Company headquarters. And so St. Regis took it over. And the gentleman on the top holding the cat is Tom Cousy, who came from Ruthenia. Now, you probably know that there's been a lot in the news lately about Ukraine. And there were Ukrainian refugees coming to America back in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And they came because they were being persecuted from a religious standpoint. There was a whole colony that established itself in Proctor, Vermont. But there were two men, and this is the first one I'm introducing you to, that went into the paper business in the Northeast Kingdom, and northern New Hampshire. And Tom Cousy was one. And because of, my father had an ear for foreign languages, so among the many foreign languages he wound up mastering, Russian was one of them. And he was really mad at the federal government for never giving him a permit to go. He never got a visa to go to Ruthenia, which he had always wanted to do. And so in being part of the managing the Dartmouth land grant is how he got to meet Tom Cousy. And there's a picture of Tom, and everybody that's still alive that remembers Tom Cousy, remembers his accent, remembers what a funny man he was. They had wonderful stories about him. There was a whole team of people from the woods industry that when it helped him get his American citizenship because he could barely speak English. My mother and I thought he was a Native American Indian because he smoked unfiltered cigarettes they rolled. That's the first time I ever saw how that was done. And he had these concentric circles, and he looked like the profile of the Native American Indian up in, it's on Route 3 near Woodstock, New Hampshire. Anyway, I always thought that Tom Cousy was Abenaki. No, he was from Ukraine. And he was just a lovely man. Nobody had a bad word to say about him, and it was a real. And I think that he called my father Pikey. P-I-K-I-E. The last time I ever saw him alive, he was making a beanhole dinner in North Stratford. Have any of you had a beanhole dinner? Oh, good. Okay. So you have to dig a hole. You have to put coals down. You have to light the coals. And then you have to have these big pots that you put in them. We tried to get this done in 2015 in Barnet, Vermont, just next door to Waterford. But the fire company was too skittish about letting that happen. So we didn't have beans to celebrate the centennial of the last long log drive. Let's see, where am I going? Yes. So if we're coming down the Connecticut River, the important thing to remember about this photograph is this is Pulp, because they're shorter. Okay, they're about 4 feet. And Stewartstown from the Connecticut River east towards Maine is heavily, heavily forested. And Van Dyke had a lot of timber in there that he was having logged out year after year after year. But in 4 short years, because this came out of the Stewartstown little history book that they did for the bicentennial in 1976, you'll see the beginnings of diesel. And so you wouldn't need horses to get the logs out of the woods. You could get trucks, and then so you wouldn't have to use the river. And other changes were happening that were going to impact about the long log drives. So this, how am I looking at? This is New Hampshire, this is Vermont, that's the covered bridge that connected West Stewartstown, New Hampshire to Canaan, Vermont. And my father was a pack rat, so I have a lot of stuff that I've tried to make sense and put it into some kind of context. So publicly, I'm sharing with you what I finally figured out about what was significant about this. Can you all read this, or do you need me to read it out loud? Okay, quote, "Day after day we paddled downstream, often in water almost choked by pulp logs which were being floated to the mills below." Now, Claude Fuse wrote this about a 1919 summer expedition from Phillips Andover Academy in Massachusetts, where Warren K. Moorhead was the director of archaeology. Now, the name Warren K. Moorhead is significant if you are into archaeology, because he's considered the dean of archaeology in America. He's not without controversy, however, because he held on to a number of the Native American artifacts that he found. But if it hadn't been for the work that he had done, there's a lot of history that would have been lost. So Warren had 2 sons. One son became the architect who helped restore Williamsburg in Virginia. If any of you have been to Williamsburg. And he had another son who went into international shipping. And he is Ludwig K. Moorhead. After the first edition of Spike Boots came out, wrote my father a letter. And they struck up this incredible friendship. And he typed his letters, thank God. And so I can read them. And this is and he was helping. He had ideas about people he thought my father should contact, and then he had tools he thought my father should have to put together a museum. So this is in their home in Connecticut. My father's holding a Peavy, Barbara is holding a scaler, and which is how you measure the length of the logs, and Lud is holding an axe. Suffice it to say, my father didn't get too far with that museum experience, and I wound up, because of somebody else you'll meet, donating all of these pieces to the New Jersey Historical Society because there was a lumber industry in South Jersey. Okay, so we're going back downriver, down through Stratford, Connecticut. And what I discovered is that there'd be this friendly competition among the loggers. It's like, okay, no mobile phones, no TV, no satellite dishes, no streaming services. So you make your own fun, right? So one of the funds that sort of tested their mettle was, how high can you stack your logs in a sled that could be pulled by horse or oxen? What I could never find out was, what was the prize? Except for bragging rights. So the logs got put down in Stratford, and they would be floating down to wherever, whoever had the contract for whatever load this was that was stamped. This is the Marianne. It's the cook shack, right? You put it on a raft, you float it downriver. And again, this was one of those charming stories my father had, was seeing the cook shack come in, because all the kids, and I've seen this in other accounts of the the man who married my father's high school girlfriend had an account of this. So I know it's like, okay, so you got two men saying the same thing, it must have happened. So the cooks would make sugar cookies that were about the size of dinner plates and would give them to the kids that would come to see them. And the cook shack on a raft is called a Mary Ann. So thanks to the folks in Pittsburgh, I discovered that this marker that used to be on Route 3 was moved down into downtown, or the flats of Stratford, New Hampshire, and they built a whole park. So the little bit of water you see there is a calm Connecticut River. I don't know what happens if it turns into a raging stream at some point, but on the other side of that is New Hampshire. So we continue our trek down. This, I love this picture. So this is a bateau. First of all, I have to say, the guys in the bateau, apparently the French Canadians were known for being very skilled at maneuvering these boats. You could put several men in them and you could go out, and from these you could pole with your Peavy and try to get the logs if they were bunched up. It was also a way, if you had extra supplies, that you could go downriver with the supplies to catch up with the Mary Ann or with the raft. Believe it or not, they actually floated horses on rafts. And so we're looking at New Hampshire is over there, and this is Guildhall, Vermont. Where are you, Jeffrey? This is your homework. So my father misidentified this, and I realized that in many ways, history can be so hyper-local that there's a language and a vocabulary that springs up, and unless you are following this along or you can decipher this, you misplace where things are. The mill was in Northumberland, New Hampshire. And there's a main street, and there are row houses, and this is where all the mill workers lived. So if you were sending if your logs were going down to Northumberland, they were going to be milled in Northumberland, New Hampshire. But all the executives, all the educated, the well-to-do, the businessmen, they lived in Guildhall, and all the houses that were built and backed up to the Connecticut River were large and well-to-do with beautiful gardens. It turns out I knew someone from Boston. I was just driving by, and there she was tending her garden. I pulled over, and she showed me her house. It's really small and very rural. But there's now a metal bridge. Of course, the wooden bridge doesn't exist anymore. But this gives you an idea of how things kept progressing down. Some logs that came from the Connecticut Lakes area would get this far. Other logs would come in from feeder streams and go down to the next point of contact where there might be a mill. And in this case, the next one is in South Lancaster and North Lunenburg. And this gives you an idea around 1915. I say circa because I'm not sure that it is 1915, of a log jam that happened. Logs went out too soon before the ice was completely broken and melted. Obviously, someone was rather anxious to get those out, and that's a rather dangerous situation. I've seen other photographs near other wooden bridges, and in fact, in Waterford, there were two wooden bridges that crossed over into New Hampshire, and the 1890 drive under George Van Dyke took out both wooden bridges, but only one was rebuilt, and that was the one in Upper Waterford. So here we go down a little further. So this is a colorful history in Gilman, which is South Lunenburg. It's a village, and basically it's a factory town, and the factory was this lumber mill, wet paper. You're manufacturing paper for paper bags. And the next Ukrainian I want to introduce you to is Isaac Gilman. And he started out as an investor in the Fitzdale Paper Company, and eventually he bought everybody out and owned it outright and built this mill in Gilman to supply New York City merchants with paper bags to put their products in and then give them to the customer. And there's a whole chapter, the Gilman Mill gets a lot of mention in there because the last manager before they closed their doors married my father's cousin. So So I did the family genealogy to figure out how they all sort of fit together. And as luck would have it, or fate would have it, she considered herself the poor-eyed, because the wealthy-eyed married G.E. Henry. And G.E. Henry was the railroad lumber king of Lincoln, New Hampshire. And if any of you have done hiking, you know about the White Mountains National Forest. Okay, that was created because Henry had literally raped the land of any trees that was left. And so when his three sons sold the business, because they didn't want to go into logging, the state made an arrangement to get some of this acreage back to create the White Mountain National Forest and have that land grow back and make it more of a nature preserve and not serve industry. Now, because of that first edition of Spike Boots that came out in 1959, one of the people that reached out to my father was cousin Kate, who was G.E. Henry's granddaughter. And so the photograph in Tall Trees and Tough Men is of her grandfather, and she wanted to make sure that if my father was going to write any more about logging, that her grandfather would be included. And so she showed up at a talk he gave at the Gould Academy in Bethel, Maine, and she had a mink stole and a pillbox hat. And she was about probably 4'9", and my mother was 5'10" and was terrified of her. So Kate Benedict was an original article, and she also wrote my father, and she typed like Ludwig Moorhead, and her letters are a real pleasure to read. She held on to property in Upper Waterford and sold it to the power company. She also, the Ide property in Upper Waterford, and she also held on for a long period of time to some of the land that her uncle and brother, her uncles and her grandfather did not sell off, or father rather, did not sell off because it has, the soil has diatomaceous, right? Which is really, it has important minerals. In this, it's good for gardening. Apparently it's also good in makeup if you sanitize it. I'm not sure how that works, but there's all kinds of stuff. But it's an important, she eventually sold that property as well. So if we keep going downstream, we get to McIndoe Falls, and here's Philo Vance, who's George's younger brother. And he's running the mill, which is on this side. So this is Vermont here, this is Monroe, New Hampshire over there. And when I took this picture from the porch of his house, this was similar to the boarding house that you saw in Canaan, Vermont. This is another Van Dyke boarding house, and he also had a general store here for the workmen. And there's one brick building that's left of the compound where they had a sawmill. Now, what you have to remember about these fellows is that some did have wives and did have families. So they only worked in the wintertime. And so they wanted to go back to their family. So for some of them, McIndoe Falls, for example, or Northumberland, New Hampshire, would be the stopping off point. They'd get their pay, because you don't get paid until after the logs get to the mill, and they would go back home and work their farms, essentially, because that's what they were. They were farmers, just like my great-uncle Harl was. So when I was here in 2017, I talked a little bit about lawsuits and George Van Dyke, and I was talking to somebody and said, I knew that some deeds that George was successful in making a deal with the property owners. And I'm going to read you this section. I had to be a pain in the you-know-what to get this. But here's what's critical in the deed. And it's if you go to Bath, New Hampshire, and look in the deed books, and it says this, accepting and reserving from the same the premises now or formerly owned and occupied by Clyde Jordan, being about 6 or 8 acres, more or less, and also accepting all rights, if any, which the Connecticut Valley Lumber Company may have to boom logs on or against said land. Now this meant that the farmer wasn't going to sue George Van Dyke for ruining his pasture land. If he didn't get permission, if the property owner didn't agree to George Van Dyke's terms, it left both entities, both the farmer as well as George Van Dyke, to either making accusations that logs had been stolen or that property had been damaged. So hold on to that, because you're going to see what happens to dear old George. So this is what it means to be booming logs off the Connecticut River bank, not far from Heartland. I think some of you here are from Heartland. And basically, you can see that the water level is really low. And so the logs get hung up on the banks of the river, and the rivermen have to go out either with their horses or by, on their own two legs with the Peavies and pull those logs back into the center channel of the Connecticut River. And that's what they call booming logs. And it's backbreaking work to do that. But timber is really valuable, and you don't want to dynamite it if you don't have to. So we continue on downriver. And this, I love this shot. It's not in any of my father's books, but I came across this because you can see all the women in their long dresses are watching the log drive, just like they would have at the Iron Bridge where my father grew up in Upper Waterford. So, and then you see and there's the Mary Ann, the raft, the cook shack going down river, and you see a couple of men floating logs. Now, my father makes the reference to them being cowboys. I tend to think of them more like surfers, right? Or guys who are, doing paddle boarding like this, because it requires a similar skill set to be on an even narrower board than a regular surfboard would. I don't really see them so much as cowboys, but that might be a generational thing, and maybe some of you would see the cowboy influence. I don't know. But it did take a skill set. And Dan Bossy probably was the most skilled, and he's coming up shortly, of all these men who could literally run across these logs floating in the river. When Tom Cousy was making the Beanhole Suppers in North Stratford for this last festival, they had put together a huge above-ground pool area, and my father was persuaded to put on a pair of caulk boots and go out there. My poor mother, I think she had an anxiety issue. She was terrified that he would die. He got dunked, and he didn't stay on very long. Of course, at this point, he's about 69 years old. So, yeah, I'm going to give him some leeway, on that. I'm not sure anybody else who was 69 would have been able to do that and stay up, unless it was Tom Cousy. So now we move a little bit further downriver. Dabney Horton, who was Dartmouth class of 1925 and was in World War I, came back to teach at Dartmouth and to teach English writing, and mentored my father. And once he found out that my father was interested in logging, he had come across a shoebox full of glass plate negatives and gave them to my father. And I inherited them and had them all printed up so that I knew what the black and white images were. And one of them is, it's a John St. Croix photo of logs coming under the old lead yard covered bridge that connected Norwich to Hanover, if you're familiar with that area now. And they kept up a relationship for a very long time, until my father sort of got up and running with writing, with getting a book contract. Hang on, don't get too excited. Save yourself. So this is the White River in Sharon, Vermont, and the logs are going out to the Connecticut River. This is one of the more dramatic photos, and also the ones that just show you the magnitude of logs and the pile of logs that are up. This is, I will tell you this, because I subscribe to this fellow who is retired from the Vermont Department of Transportation. He used AI to put it in color, and I have to say, the color makes this really pop in a way that the black and white photograph does not have the same impact on this. Sumner Falls, my front row people. Okay. So does anybody know the name Cummings with the American Precision Museum in Windsor? Okay, so Herb Cummings was another man who found my father through spiked boots and would type letters to my father and say, you should interview this person, you should interview that person, you should interview this person. And he found Charlie Barber's grave there. And the two of them worked together to have a stone put up that he would always be remembered. And in Tall Trees, Tough Men, my father recounts the story of how he lost this young, he was 16 years old, and he lost his life in the log drive. They drowned, which is, unfortunately, it does happen, and it's not because they don't know how to swim, it's because the logs, once you slip down below the logs, you can't come back up again. And his father, on horseback, came all the way to get his pay and turned around, didn't want the body, and went all the way back to Maine with the paycheck. So the loggers likely put him in a pork barrel, because that's what happened when the bodies would come up to the surface of any of the rivermen who lost their lives, and they would put them in a pork barrel, and they would bury them where they lived, and they would usually take their spike boots and nail them to the tree, and that was their gravestone. Okay, so I told you about how the 1890 log drive took out the two covered bridges in Waterford. It also, in which one? Yes, this is 1897. It took out two of the piers that were built by the Boston and Maine Railroad Company to get, people back and forth across the river to Maine, and it took out two of the piers. It took the railroad company 9 years to get their money from George Van Dyke. It was 1906 by the time they saw a check for their materials and their labor to rebuild these piers. But you can just imagine the force if the water is high and it's running fast, and you have too many logs in the river, the impact, and if you have stone piers that aren't well constructed, how it can inflict this kind of damage. Okay. Now, I know you all here are from Springfield. Well, not all of you. I came across this, but I don't know anything at all about it. It was 1913. Does anybody know about this log drive? Any read about it in any local history? If you do come across it, send me an email, because I'd like to have a little bit more information on this. It's pretty spectacular, and you can see the men sort of skipping across the logs, moving them down. But I never know what I'm going to find when I do a talk like this, and so there might be somebody who gets inspired and will find something. Okay, so Bellows Falls had a number of paper mills there, so it would be a destination for lumber, and then there'd be lumber that would go bypassing this. And you get an idea of what this looks like from the top photograph. This was also important in terms of economic development, because the canal designer looked at, who helped Bellows Falls / Rockingham figure out how to build a canal there, was then invited to come up north river to Woodsville and try to create a similar situation in the Narrows in Woodsville. And he said, it's too steep, too narrow, you'll never get a canal up here. So the economic development of the North Country, north of Bellows Falls, really slowed down a lot because of this. And river traffic, you just couldn't go upstream. And downstream was an adventure that you did risk breaking your neck. So the Bellows Falls has a huge important role in terms of making the logging industry, or contributing to the logging industry, eventually diminishing its impact on the Connecticut River. So now we come. Yeah, here's another pileup in Brattleboro. Now, it's just, it's staggering to look at that, but the color photograph of Vernon Dam is the death knell of logging on the Connecticut River. So it turns out, when I was putting this together for you, 1909 turns out to show up in a lot of the pictures that I was unconsciously choosing because I wanted to tell the story differently. And the Vernon Dam and the New England Power Company, which these were investors out of Boston who wanted to harness the power of the Connecticut River for all the factories in Massachusetts. That was their first goal. They needed electricity for those factories because water power could be converted through its actions to create electricity, and it would be a lot better from a business standpoint to have that. Initially, what Vernon had was a sluiceway where the logs could come through, and it did for a while until after 1915, not so much. So the destination for a lot of this was in, Massachusetts, Turner's Falls, which is it's a village in the town of Montague. I think that's how you pronounce it. Yes, and eventually International Paper owns this mill. But here's the spectacular aerial view of it. So you see how they have the canal down there to funnel the water and the logs, or the rest of the water to go down on the river this way. And you see how rocky it is. If you remember back around, I think 2021, 2022, when we were in COVID, we had a drought, if you remember that summer. And I went around and photographed as many places on the Connecticut River as I could where you could see the rocks. It's like looking at a river's rib cage. And I started to realize how dangerous it was. If you didn't drown, you were but the logs pushed you down. If you were a riverman and you hit your head and you were unconscious, and then you would drown. But it wasn't a soft, muddy riverbank, right? It's not the boggy, Fourth Connecticut Lake by any stretch of the imagination. It's all rock. And this is where George Van Dyke met his end. So he went down in 1909. Shorty was driving, Fred Hodgson, and they parked his. It was a Stevens Duryea. It was a car was barely a year old, and there are conflicting accounts of exactly what happened. Either Shorty didn't know that he threw the car into reverse, or something happened and it jumped backwards, and they both went over with the car and met their death on the rocks. They lingered for a few days, but the internal injuries were so extensive that neither one of them recovered. And both men are buried in the Summer Street Cemetery in Lancaster, George with his mother and a few other relatives, and Shorty with his wife. And it wasn't too many years afterwards that in settling George Van Dyke's estate, that eventually St. Regis Paper Company came and bought him out. So I want to go back, to this idea of deforestation, because in Tall Trees, Tough Men, my father mentions Mount Tom, and Mount Tom is the mountain in the back, but it's actually Hadley, Massachusetts, and this is where you had a lot of mills making all kinds of paper products, as well as woolen products, clothing products. And the one that I singled out here because it spoke to me about paper is called the Albion Paper Mill, and that's the one there on the left. And they made book, envelope, and writing paper, and it was a rate at 2 tons a day to 20 tons a day in 1880. So the need for paper goods was outsized, in my opinion. But it's what made Hadley, Massachusetts, what it is. And it's taken from about 1900. That's what Hadley, Mass, just farmland, very few trees. Now, if you were to drive down there, if you go down 91, you'll see that the trees have come back. It started to get, it's been reforested, so it doesn't look so bare and open like that. Okay, so if you remember, this was the photograph of my dad from the beginning of this presentation. Last summer, I worked on a project in Waterford to identify a lot of different visual artifacts that we had accumulated. And I decided to do one on my father and all of his books and the people associated with his books. And he sort of overlooks the Vermont collection in the Davies Memorial Library in Lower Waterford. Should you be driving up that way and you want to, stop in? It's a former general store, so there's a lot of elements that still look like it. What I want to share with you today is the fact that the 1950s, when I looked at all of this, turned out to be a really pivotal year. My parents got married. My father drives his Parisian wife that he found in World War II up to Back Lake for a honeymoon. Dan Bossy, and this is a picture he took of him up in Colebrook, dies in the state hospital. He became an alcoholic. And I had a young man from that area ask me if I knew where Dan Bossy was buried, and I didn't, but I went looking. And I found him in the Meadow Cemetery, which is where the New Hampshire State Hospital Cemetery is located in Clinton Street. So that's where he is, and somebody paid for his marker, and I've kind of been stumped getting any information about who paid for that, because I have a feeling my father and his sister, who was a dietitian at the state hospital, might have gone in to buy the stone for Dan Bossy, because he had no family, no wife, no children, no family to speak of. And this was a list my father kept of all the people who had bought by subscription to buy the first copy of Spike Boots. And then Leon Tebbets went bankrupt. And before I was born, my parents go back up to Lower Waterford, and this is a stump in front of the tree in the house where my father was raised. There's nothing left, right? This is all just tall grass. Everything's been removed, and soon it's going to be flooded. It's a phenomenal amount of reservoir water. I don't recall the number offhand. And one of the saddest things was my father was trying to reach Vern Davison, and his cousin wrote my father to say Vern had died. And so Vern never knew about Spike Boots, and that he was the narrator for that. So this is how we spent my 4th birthday. My parents were selling Spike Boots out of the trunk of the car. I was in the back seat with all the luggage, and the sales pitch was, here, you'll want to buy this book because you're in it. That I clearly remember. And then we went with Uncle Harlan and his wife Ida to have dinner at the Robert Hill Inn. I never put any of this together until I had enough of this laid out. So when I wrote the foreword to the 4th edition of Spiked Boots, I was writing it in New Jersey from the standpoint of being the daughter of a college professor. I would write it completely differently today. Also, that book, the first edition of Spike Boots, brought the Dartmouth Forester into my father's orbit. And I found the letter from Bob Monahan saying, if you ever do another edition of Spike Boots, you might want to include Jigger Johnson. He was my Vern Davison and helped me grow up. And he had this picture that he supplied, then Dad put it in Tall Trees, Tough Men. And so he eventually made enough money to pay off the people and make sure everybody who paid a subscription got a copy, and then he made another copy in hardcover. And I took this picture not in 1987, not the greatest, but this was the hardcover of Spiked Boots, and it's all in gold, and it's a copy, it's a pair of Spiked Boots. And this is Rosemary Miller, who was one of only 2 female principals in the Peacham Academy in Peacham, Vermont, before World War II, which is quite an accomplishment. And then the war came, and she winds up after the war in New Jersey, on the Jersey Shore, at this college that's the only replica of Versailles in the whole United States. It was built by the nickels and dimes of the vice president of F.W. Woolworth. And then he went bankrupt in a crash in 1929, and it became a private college. And that's where my father landed after the war. And at a faculty meeting, there's a woman and she's doodling, and then she has something to say, and he hears the Yankee accent. And therein sparked a friendship that lasted long enough until she retired to Peacham, and we went to visit her in 1987, and I made sure I got at least this picture of her holding a copy of the cover of the book that she had designed. She was my math tutor because I was really bad at math. And she also made really great gingerbread. Rosemary Miller, is her name. And she said if I had learned math on an abacus, I would be fine. Would have been fine. So Cowles Press in St. Johnsbury doesn't exist anymore, but it was in 1987, and I made sure I got a picture of my father. Again, I think it's like shoot now, ask questions later. And the third edition is by Yankee Publishing. They kind of sanitize the language in Spiked Boots. Some people call this the white cover. There's the red cover, the white cover, and then there's the soft cover that I wrote the edition for. And this is the librarian at the time of the Davies Library, and we're in Concord, Vermont, at a book signing. And we had a lot of fun, but it was a lot of work. So if you ever take Tall Trees, Tough Men, the soft cover edition, you go to the library and get the hardcover out. There's a man named Fred Node. He also wrote my father after the first edition of Spiked Boots. He also had worked for George Van Dyke. And my father flew out to spend time with him on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. So a lot of the stories came, and a lot of things that, factual things that Fred Node had, he shared with my father. There's almost no correspondence from Fred Node to my dad, so I think a lot of it took place in this 3 to 4 day period that he spent out there. And I promised you the Lady Lager of Lyme. Now, I remember I was probably about 8 years old when we found Ruth. And I think Herb Cummings was the one who put my father on to her. And she took over her father's lumber business. And so he has a chapter in Tall Trees, Tough Men. There's also a book out called Lumber Queen. If you're interested in that, I highly recommend it, by Ellen Anderson, because she was given access to all the family's papers. But I have Ruth Park's attempt at writing a memoir that she sent my father, and my father's notes to her, telling her how to improve the storytelling, because she was very much, she had a pared down approach to life. I wouldn't exactly call her having much of a sense of humor. And she went down to Lumberton, New Jersey. I have a letter to my father from a visit that she made there to a lumber mill. So she kept in touch with this until she died. I don't know what I'm going to do with her memoir, but I have read excerpts from it. I did that in 2015 for the last Long Log Drive Festival we had in Barnet, thanks to the Barnet history folks and the library there. And then, okay, so these are the 3 different covers. And I am going to ask your help, if you want to. You don't have to do this, you don't have to tell me. But this is clearly somewhere on the Connecticut River. In 1984, it came out in soft cover. This is a book. It's falling apart. When I see people who have this, the glue is dried out, it's falling apart, it's peeling, it's a soft cover, so the front of it's peeling. The production value wasn't particularly high, in my humble opinion. And then when the Countryman Press approached me about coming out with a 4th edition of Spiked Boots, for which I got to write the foreword, they had already been acquired by W.W. Norton, and the original deal was the 2 covers were going to be compatible. And instead, and this is when the Countryman Press was located in Woodstock, Vermont, they were really disappointed that this was a photograph while they had a watercolor. Not compatible, not even complimentary at all. And it's taken me, I had to keep at this for a while. And now, finally, I discovered that this is an archival photograph from Oregon. So, this was from my talk in 2019. So there's W.W. Norton. That's their address. You can write me. I can send you a link. Next year will be the 60th anniversary of Tall Trees, Tough Men. It has been in continuous print since 1967, which is a remarkable feat. And I would dearly love to see a new cover. And I think some of you might too. So this is Sid Sawyer, who showed up at the talk in 2019, and he had the copy. His father and my father were roommates at Dartmouth College, yada, 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 and he showed up with this picture. I have this picture. And so people come out of the woodwork and tell me all kinds of things that I wouldn't have known otherwise if I didn't opt to do these public talks. I'm not going to do very many more of them going forward, which is why I agreed to have this videotaped for posterity. I got at least 10 good years left in me, so I'm going to raise hell when I can. And you're welcome to come along. And I have a website. I think this is how you found me. Yes. So you just, it's a Gmail. Eventually, it'll default to a Gmail account, but that's how you find me if you want. I can't, as my father's literary heir, I cannot make W.W. Norton do anything they don't want to do. But if you, the reading public, tell them, they will bow to you. That's how it works. I've published enough to know. It's the readers who make that determination. And I'm certainly going to come at it from the standpoint of facts. Oregon should not be on this cover of a book about New England. So there you have it. And now I will take questions.
Were there many different companies running laws in Connecticut? Was it all just one?
There were private timberland owners. I wouldn't necessarily call them companies. So they might have been doing this for their neighborhood, their extended family. They might have been selling the cut board lumber to somebody who wanted to build a house. So it's on a much more of a micro scale. It wasn't this large operation where you subcontracted to George Van Dyke to drive your logs down the river to wherever your mill was. Most of this was his own wood, but you could, I've discovered that if you wanted somebody to come in and cut your wood, you could get George Van Dyke's men to do that. Of course, you have to pay, on that. Yes, lady in yellow.
It was a family here in Springfield, high school with kids named Peavy. And they were from Maine, and they moved back to Maine. And they were related to whoever involved with Peavy.
Joseph Peavy. Yeah.
Company's still there.
Yeah, so there's a picture of Joseph Peavy in the In Tall Trees, Tough Men. And so, do you know what the difference is between a Peavy and a cant dog? Who's heard the term cant dog?
Peavy has a spike outside, and the other one is for usually on the low floor.
Yes, so it's flat. It doesn't. A cant dog, it has a flat tip, and the Peavy has the spike. So the Peavy was used mostly in the river drives or in the woods to bring the logs to. If the logs were stacked up, you could move them more easily with the Peavy. With the cant dog, you could also move them and not damage the logs as much. And you could also, how do I want to say this? I think I'm going to leave it at that without going into any granular detail.
This is a question, but I just wanted to contribute that my husband and I hiked the Coast Trail, the school trail that follows the Connecticut River all the way up to the source and to the farthest lakes and English. So it's interesting, especially now that I know what's going on in the river today.
And it's a beautiful walk. I mean, it's a beautiful hike. If you
It's not difficult because it's mainly ATV or ski trails. Sometimes it's not on mountains.
Right. It's not like the long trail through Vermont. Yeah.
I also like that.
You had a picture of Ruth Carr, Tommy Pond. Any idea what year that might have been?
I'm going to say probably around 1966.
I used to go fishing up there with my dad, Tommy Pond. And remember, there used to be this old lady that used to come out and give us a ration for going across her property. I think that was Ruth.
Thank you. I debated whether or not to share with you a limerick that cousin Kate wrote about Ruth, because I didn't want to be disrespectful to the dead. But apparently she did have a tart tongue. So, yes.
Now, was the idea to drop off or sell these logs on the way down, like the Bellows Falls or Brattleboro or wherever else?
Well, there was a contract for them, right? So ahead of time. It wasn't speculative, right? George had either George Van Dyke, or if he was somebody contracted him to do for him. I didn't put it in this slide. There were stamps, iron stamps with a monogram or an identifying mark. My father had stationery made up with all the ones he had collected of this, so that you would know who the owner was of the logs that had that particular stamp on them. I think now if you see the logging trucks around here, it's a spray paint and there's a number of some kind that sort of tags them, right? So if these logs, if you saw the iron imprint of who the logs belonged to, you would know, you were told, if you're the walking boss, you were told where which mill this logs were going to go to, right? It could have gone to Alcott's mills at Alcott in Wilder, if there's a mill there. There were other mills, but that's how they could tell the difference. If it was and I think there is I'm kind of regretting I didn't do this. I think George Van Dyke did have his own stamp so that they knew which logs were his.
How far did the log drive go?
Well, most of them, the longest of George Van Dyke's log drives went to Mount Tom, Hadley, Massachusetts. And I haven't found any evidence of logs that went south of that into Connecticut. Not to say that it didn't happen, just, yeah, I only have so many hours in a day. I think we got, oh, sorry, yes.
That's okay. A couple of things. First one is, I can see why your dad talked about these men as cowboys, because they were branding the logs just like you brand cattle, and you
Sure.
the cattle down. So I can see that now.
That connection, yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I really don't think they're dead mine, and I think you should share them.
Wait a minute. Let me see, hold on. I will. No, I'll read it out loud. It'll be let's see. I did weed this out. Once this hit 60 slides, I started weeding it out. Let's see. Oh, here she is. So here's Kate Benedict's. There is a stout lady in Lyme who whacks down fir, balsam, and pine. When asked to a levee, French social event in parens, she shouldered her Peavy and said, "For such stuff I have no time." And Kate was friends with Sherm Adams, who built Loon Mountain Resort, but he was also the chief of staff for Eisenhower. He lost his job over the Vicuna coat affair. But you can look that up. And I did laugh when I saw that. So he responded to Kate saying, "Beware of the Park woman. She has a forked tongue." And then he wrote a limerick back. "In Lyme lived a woman named Park, whose bite was as bad as her bark. She hacked down the trees while she hissed in the breeze and made seldom a friendly remark. There, I think that's a good note to end on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming out.
To order copies of this program, please call 802-885-6248. This program was created using equipment of SAPA TV. The views and opinions expressed in this video are not necessarily those of SAPA TV or its staff. Visit us online at www.sapatv.org. And as always, thanks for watching.